Welcome to the first session of Le Door Speaker Series 2026. We're very exciting. Our opening session is Helen Schamroth, which we had the pleasure to cooperate with. And she will talk around 45 to 50 minutes, and afterwards we'll have a discussion. If you have a question, during the talk, I suggest to just write it in the WhatsApp, and afterwards in the discussion part, we will address it. Or you can just wait for the discussion part and raise your hand, and immediately you can see, 1 second, whoop, a raising hand icon. Any questions? All good? Perfect. So thank you all for coming. And with no further ado, Helen, I'm giving you the stage.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Shalom. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak about the legacy we inherit as part of this Lodz program of the Holocaust Centre. Thank you for your introduction, Tom, and for all your help. And thank you to the team at the Holocaust Centre who entrusted this topic to me. And thanks, as always, to my partner, Michael, who can be relied upon to help me with technology and images. Whilst I've now become more at ease speaking about my recently published book, 18 for Life, Surviving the Holocaust, speaking about the issues that emerge when discussing the legacy we inherit takes me into emotional and new, if related, territory. I've felt the need to interrogate the subject through a personal lens in the hope of understanding the plural and how it has been for others. I'm sorry this isn't a topic that engenders a lot of laughs, although part of the legacy we may have inherited is humour, maybe black humour, as a coping mechanism. Everyone inherits some sort of legacy from their families. My heritage is the Holocaust, and I'm of the second generation. I was born in Krakow, Poland in 1945, a few months after the war ended, to Martha and Felix Ash, who were the only survivors of their respective families. One's heritage is not of one's choosing, and it's integral to who we are. The question posed by the topic actually goes beyond the legacy that we inherit. It's the impact of that legacy on our lives and our children's lives. But first, the essential part of my legacy are those who came before me, the very few for whom I have images. This topic might suggest that a psychology background would be useful, but that's not what I bring. My education has been in architecture, craft, art history, and spatial design. And along the way, I discovered a love of writing. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I've worked as a craft artist, writer, arts consultant, curator, and arts advocate. What I hope to bring to the discussion is the creative urge that drives me, because I believe that creativity in its many forms is what helps survivors and their descendants to process the world's most tragic event of the 20th century. I should have expected that I would end up involved in the arts, despite originally pursuing the maths and science route. So my career was unexpected to me. My mother was a craftswoman and an artist. Her mother became a milliner when she had to earn a living after being widowed and was left with a small baby. And my mother's father, my grandfather, I understand that he painted watercolours. I'm really sorry I never knew them and could never learn from them, but maybe some of their abilities came to me through our genes. And on my father's side, well, his father made shoes, another craftsperson. My mother was quite a storyteller, and as much as I rolled my eyes when I was young, and when she embarked on one of her lengthy stories, I was immensely grateful for the very chatty conversation she had had with an interviewer. The recorded interview provided insights into her life and her mother's life. My grandmother's story, as told by my mother, was a real bonus, as it was full of loving detail and opened my eyes to a generation I never knew. And it revealed incredible resilience. The absence of grandparents in my life is matched in the stories of many of the second generation. When one grows up in a tiny nuclear family like mine, with no living grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, it can be quite intense, and that formed a significant part of my legacy. I really felt an absence growing up without an extended family. It was not only lonely for my parents, but for me as a child. I recall friends of the family who had come to Australia, which is where I grew up, before the war, and some had a grandparent or even two or more. I couldn't imagine having 4 grandparents. Occasionally, survivors managed to bring a parent with them to Australia. The grandparents would sometimes include us, extending their hospitality and affection to us. It helped, but it wasn't the same as having my own family. So I really welcomed the birth of my baby sister. As I was growing up, my mother often told me that after the war, I was her only possession. Well, intellectually, I could understand that as an adult, but emotionally, as a child, it was claustrophobic. This overprotection and fear of separation is not uncommon from what I read in the literature about the mental health of survivors and their offspring. This possessiveness can become a burden for the child to behave, to conform and to be successful, to take advantage of the opportunities their parents missed out on. For some of the second generation, there has been coercion to please the parents and to satisfy the parents' needs. Maybe that's also a legacy for immigrant and refugee offspring, not just for Jews after the Holocaust. I think it was all well-meaning, but oppression nonetheless. In my book, I talk about how my parents never wanted to talk to us about the past. And I'm going to read you just a little clip because it says a little bit more than I would have here. I don't know much about their wartime experiences. Don't ask, Mum would say with a theatrical sigh. It was too horrible to talk about. We lost everybody. We are lucky we are making a new life in a new country. I don't want to boost. Does he mean boast? I don't want that you are thinking I am a hero, Dad said, his voice trembling. It was survival. And another time, people are doing terrible things when they are being desperate. I try to ask him what he means, but he prefers to talk cryptically about black times in the past and lighting up his life now. Is that why you keep all the lights on? I ask, thinking about how often he says, Helenka, darling, put me on the light. I lived in darkness for too many days after being in the Death Brigade, he explains. The Death Brigade? I know I'm on dangerous territory, but he did say it, and I really want to know. A stinking hellhole. One day, maybe I will tell you, Dad says quietly, his eyes glistening in a way that reminds me not to ask anymore. Some of my contemporaries had a similar experience. There have been survivors who've never revealed anything about their wartime experiences or even what came before it. The past was to be ruled off, never to be discussed, whereupon survivors and descendants lived with an unspoken burden. Who can blame these survivors for their silence? How could it not affect them and their descendants? On the other hand, there were some parents who did talk about the past. Some did so endlessly. There were those who, like a friend of my mother, painted sad, dark images of the shtetl, the camp, and more. They wanted their children to know and to be understanding of them. Some survivors talked about the Holocaust in the hope that lessons would be learned and it should never happen again. I know that when my father finally talked to an interviewer about the war, it was because he felt obliged to bear witness, to tell his story in case it wasn't believed that 6 million had perished. Just after the war ended, there were survivors who felt a real need to tell the world about what had happened. My father mentioned this. He said, there were so few of us left that we had to tell somebody. We all needed to tell the world somehow. There were the testimonies at the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials, and the first books about the Holocaust came out, including The Death Brigade, written by Leon Wells, who had been a young inmate of Janoska Totenbrigade, the death camp from which he and my father, along with 134 others, escaped, although only 13 survived the escape. And yet it has been said that it was hard to reach an audience. Many people were tired of hearing about the war. All the same, the first acts of post-war creativity by survivors included memoirs full of anguish and pain, and fiction based on fact. How brave they were to allow the trauma to resurface so soon, or had it never left them. Wanting to tell the world was different from wanting to tell your children. When parents like ours didn't want to talk about the war, of course, we children became curious. And occasionally snippets emerged in an unguarded moment. In my book, I tell how my sister and I tried to deal with their reticence. And I'll read you another piece. Come on, Helen, what do they say in Polish when they don't want us to understand? They're so obvious, aren't they? I wish I knew more Polish. But I sometimes get the hang of what they're saying. Actually, it's often pretty boring. Evie refuses to be sidetracked so easily. You're as bad as Dad when he goes off on tangents. Come on, I want to know about the war. How did they survive? Tell me, go on. All they say is that no one else in their families saw the end of the war. They're keeping secrets for sure. Yep, I once heard someone say something about Dad breaking out of a camp. Did they have camps like camping in tents? No, like the most awful, unimaginable prisons. It's pretty amazing to think he really did that. You're kidding, but Dad's not like that. He's even pathetic about hitting flies. And I don't believe we are so pathetic that we should give in to not knowing. I wonder what it would take to get him to talk. Don't even think about it, Evie. Promise me, or you'll start World War III. I know because Mum yelled and yelled and yelled at me when I tried to get him to tell me stuff. Okay, I promise, for now. But what if we never find out? It's so unfair. I want to know. With hindsight, I realise that silence or therapy are not the only ways of processing trauma. For some, the trauma didn't really get processed, and those survivors could become reactive to their offspring. This manifested itself in many ways, including depression, manipulation, bullying, even violence. The research shows that what happened during the war and immediately post-war, and I realise that not everyone's experience was the same, this could determine much about the future lives of survivors and their offspring. Some survivors found that being a narrator, whilst traumatic, relieved them of holding on to the past. Oral history has been a way for a number of cultures to process grief and pain about the past, and at the same time inform the next generations. The books by survivors, the fiction based on fact, the creative non-fiction, memoirs, short stories, as well as films, theatrical and musical performances, visual art and crafts. These reveal their memories and innermost thoughts. How powerful it is for second generation and third generation to consume these. They are the preserved memories, direct from those who endured those fateful years. My mother chose to speak through her art. She once said to me, "You know, my art is my therapy. No counsellors, schmounselors. This way I can think about beauty and colour and happy things, not such horrible reality." Yet eventually she put the Holocaust into her art. It was when she was creating a mural from creation to redemption for outside of Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne. She showed me her sketches and asked me to help her enlarge them for this very big mural. Amongst the sketches was one that referenced the Holocaust. It was the first time I had seen this in her art, although I subsequently saw more drawings and a small enamel or copper work. She intuitively had come to the conclusion that making art was a way to process the trauma. Interestingly, my mother's brave move influenced me, I, who was never going to be just like my mother. Sometime later, I felt moved to express the Holocaust in my artwork. I had been really cautious about revealing my heritage in my art for quite a few years. Perhaps it was a leftover of the keep your head down attitude when I was at primary school. If I didn't talk about being Jewish and that my parents had been in the war, then I would be like the other children, and hopefully I would be accepted in the playground. But now, if my mother was prepared to depict the Holocaust in her art, then surely as second generation, I should try too. It made me think about other Jewish artists, and I was especially impressed by Art Spiegelman and his extraordinary ability to produce Maus, a Holocaust story told through his cartoons. It's common knowledge that Holocaust survivors experience trauma, but what of their children? My sister and I are adamant that we had a wonderful childhood. It was seemingly untroubled by the pain and trauma of our parents' lives. Gradually, I had learnt a little about the war, and I knew that concentration camps and gas chambers existed. I also knew that somehow my parents had gone through the war and survived, although I didn't really know how. I didn't connect how it affected me until much later, when I recalled my childhood dreams. This little piece was when I was a teenager. Sometimes in the shower, I try to imagine what it was like for those poor people standing under a shower of poison gas. Water pours over me as I stare up at the nozzle, agonizing about those naked people, men, women, and children about to die. As my tears wash away, I wonder how women managed the camps when they had their periods. Did they still have them? And I sometimes lie awake at night, listening for guards and dogs. How blinkered are mum and dad not to realise how much I know. Not to mention how often I think about the stories I've heard. It was only a few years ago that I articulated my understanding of why my parents didn't want to talk about their survival. My sister and I were talking about my father's escape from Yonoska Death Brigade. It's challenging to read this aloud, but I will. What an extraordinary man Dad was. It's great that you sat with him through that interview. It must have been so hard for him to talk about. No wonder he tried to run out of the interview with the microphone still attached. By the way, Helen, did you know that Dad had made a statement at the German embassy in Melbourne? Apparently it was used at the Nuremberg trials, according to the historian Wakeman Bjorn I've been in touch with. No, I didn't know. I'm relieved that I didn't know all this while I was growing up. It would have been such a burden. No wonder Mum and Dad fobbed off my questions and got so mad when I persisted. Absolutely. It drove me crazy that they wouldn't talk. I was a real pain demanding to know. We both were, and so unaware. They were protecting us all the time. When I confront the facts of his survival, I'm amazed at what he did in self-defense. And every time I get goosebumps. It's a lot to digest. He was incredible, and it's such a new insight into Felix the prisoner, the escapee. So much more than Felix the husband, the friend, the father, the employer. I love him even more for his audacity and his extraordinary bravery. Can you imagine how traumatized he must have been just thinking about what he had done, and after his escape, wondering whether the Germans would find him in hiding? The conversations between me and my sister were important, not just when I was writing my book, this book, but also when she was producing her documentary film, Man on the Bus, our family story told through her eyes. I recall her saying, you know, we need to really listen to Mum's and Dad's tapes again. It's as though we block out details and the pain of it all every time we listen to them. So we never really hear the complete stories. My recent research led me to the European Journal of Psychotraumatology. Bear with me, please. This discusses intergenerational consequences of the Holocaust on the mental health of the second generation. For a number of years, I didn't think I needed therapy to deal with any intergenerational consequences, until I began to tentatively explore ideas about the Holocaust in my art. I didn't think I was traumatized by what my parents went through, mainly because for a long time, I didn't know much. Yet my artwork said something else. And after a while, I realized that my artwork had become therapeutic, a way of dealing with whatever it was. And it was inherited trauma. The concept of inherited trauma had been explained to me, but in fact, I didn't think it was relevant to me. I recall one of my first artworks that referenced the Holocaust. It was for an exhibition called Making My Mark by women artists. My piece, Making My Mark for the 6 Million Dead, hung from the wall and it swept across the floor. One of the things we did as a group of exhibitors after the opening of the exhibition was to debrief about the exhibition and our individual works. It was friendly and informal. When it came to my turn, I talked about how this was about my parents' lives. The response was empathetic to the point of being overwhelming. This was the first time that I experienced the power of personal visual stories. And that power is not just for me and fellow Jews for whom the Holocaust sits on our shoulder, so to speak. I believe it's a heritage that is owned much more broadly than by just immediate descendants. As you enter the Holocaust Gallery at Auckland War Memorial Museum, that work is what you see first. Making it was cathartic. It released much emotion and long conversations with a counsellor friend. I had come out not just as a Jewish artist, but one with Holocaust heritage and inherited trauma to process. And so began my equivalent of therapy, like my mother, and enough artworks to fill several exhibitions. Curiously, this led to my writing. I had written about the creative sector for many years, but now what I did was try to understand what I was intuitively creating. There were scribbled jottings, which led to my first short stories, and eventually my book, which moved from 18 connected fictional stories to creative non-fiction. It was my memoir. That was a very long emotional journey. In exploring how survivor trauma is transmitted to others, I discovered aspects about which I didn't think I had experienced. For instance, some children of survivors reported high levels of anxiety, depression, PTSD symptoms, even if they didn't directly experience the trauma. It was like a haunted sense of fear. And there was a need for children of survivors to be perfect, something I did sense. Or maybe they over-identified with the parents' past suffering. Not speaking about the Holocaust, that silence can actually communicate as much as open discussion. A child only has to witness a survivor parent suffering from migraines, nightmares, and physical illness to start linking that to the past. There is a scientific explanation that stress can be transmitted to the next generation, reflecting a biological, not just psychological impact. It is explained as epigenetic changes, such as a particular gene, the FKBP5 gene, which is related to stress responses. It can impact the second and third generations. Importantly, the legacy we inherit is not only about trauma. Many families like mine passed on remarkable resilience and a strong sense of identity. And any so-called inherited pain was transformed into meaning and purpose. Like my parents, I have felt driven to live fully, as if to justify being alive. I found it significant that research has shown that overall, Holocaust survivor offspring did not quantitatively represent more signs of mental health problems than non-survivor offspring. This was a relief to me. To this day, I can't fathom how my parents came through such incredible pain and trauma, yet created a positive family life and contributed so positively to their community. I especially identified with the research that posed a challenge to examine those parents and children who managed to cope, adjust, and or build up a healthy life, as this might help unveil factors contributing to resilience more broadly. And so I come to post-memory, which was a new term for me, although not an entirely new concept. Dr. Marianne Hirsch at Columbia University, the daughter of Jewish parents who survived the war in hiding in Romania, is credited with developing the concept which describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. The trauma that most concerns her as being of that generation after is the Holocaust. She defines the generation after both as those who survived the war as young children and to the second generation, the children born after the war. Post-memory is not identical to memory. Whatever one experiences as post-memory is something one did not experience directly. Yet the stories and behaviours that children of survivors grew up with have the emotional power of memories. Hirsch comes to the conclusion that post-memory's connection to the past is mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. She believes in the power of art. The post in the term post-memory implies that it is not simply a pale imitation that comes after the real thing, but rather a meaningful experience in itself that we best understand as being in addition to the original. She describes it as the way a post-it note is layered on top of a document. And she acknowledges that survivor memories can overwhelm their children, but refuses to accept that this experience makes those children victims. From a personal point of view, I agree with her. In post-memory, everything depends on how critically and self-consciously people respond to past traumatic events. The question remains, how can the second generation respond appropriately to the overwhelming trauma of others? Descendants can live with a memory vacuum, as I did throughout my childhood and early adulthood. That memory vacuum is shaped by a past we didn't personally experience, but it still profoundly defines our present identity and worldview. The research goes on to say that the legacy of the Holocaust continues to be a living, evolving, and often complex presence in the lives of descendants, which highlights both the lasting impact of extreme trauma and the human capacity for adaptation. I want to hold on to the latter because I do believe that we can adapt. Maybe I believe that because my parents did. One of the ways of descendants adapting is to write, writing what they know, writing what they think they know, writing what they've learned, and writing what they imagine. It's actually very different from survivor writing. It's dependent on intergenerational transmission and expression of Holocaust memory, trauma, and representation. This is a shift in perspective. It's indirect, and the narrative voice has a different personality. And then there is memory, except it's not the writer's memory. Survivors record their direct experience of the Holocaust. For the second generation, the writing comes from a haunting legacy shaped by the imagination. So the character and texture of memory are reconfigured. Descendants choose to be a witness to the events. And as memory recedes, it becomes transformed into history, as Guli Naaman Arad suggests. So there is a transition from the immediacy and proximity of what is no doubt subjective recall of the survivor to the history presented by the second generation. The survivor might have recalled the texture, the sensation, the emotion, the detail, or maybe just the enormity of the trauma. My father's interview was recorded in 1979, more than 3 decades after the war ended. In it, he speaks with clarity about his time at the Jonosta concentration camp and the Totenbrigade within the camp. The trauma is conveyed strongly. He's articulate, and it is part of who he is. I don't for one moment doubt the veracity of it. Elie Wiesel writes in his book, Night, I did see this with my own eyes. I can almost hear my father saying the same thing. So when I chose to retell that story in my book, the story obviously was revealed through my lens. For my father, the memories were intrinsic to him, while for me, the story had become accessible through what has been described as imaginative refocusing. Mine isn't an eyewitness account. It's a borrowed memory, secondary, inexact, even approximate. I'm at a distance, but I also feel obliged to bear witness to the enormity of the past. Eva Hoffman suggested that the transmitted memory of the Shoah for post-survivor generations is an example of an internalized past, of the way in which atrocity literally reverberates through the minds and lives of subsequent generations. The intergenerational transmission of trauma from survivor to non-witnesses, as Gary Weissman describes them, makes demands on the imagination and on the nature of telling. Retelling an experience like the Holocaust can't comment on that experience so much as demonstrate, exhibit, and continue itself. Language becomes a defense against forgetting. History is recorded to ensure that historical realities are transmitted to future generations. Survivors tell and write from direct experience, yet they write their accounts retrospectively. Like my mother's interview, it was recorded so many years later. It was fascinating to read the transcript and find that stories told to me some years earlier were quite different. It was hard to know what was true, what she recalled when talking to a stranger rather than to me. Was she trying to protect me from something? Just to be sure, in my book, I told both versions. Reading about Primo Levi saying in his book, Survival in Auschwitz, that none of the facts are invented, it suggested that the facts are inevitably arbitrated by and filtered through the ambushes, reflections, and calculations of memory, as well as its defenses and instincts for deflection, repression, and survival. No wonder I couldn't help but wonder about the accuracy of the interviews my father had in 1979 and my mother in the early 80s. There had to be room for their defenses and instincts and time for memory to play tricks. But there is no uncertainty of the events. And as is suggested in the literature, I'm reminded that memory is fractured, hesitant, clouded by time and grief, subject to correction, and woefully inadequate to the task of transmission. Those first-hand accounts are structured by traumatic recall. The question then becomes, how can I, with the imperfect memory that isn't mine, what might it mean and require to participate in such memory? And then the third generation, when there is a conscious awareness of the history and they have been material but not culturally excluded. Gary Weissman suggests that non-witnesses like me can be haunted, not by the traumatic impact of the Holocaust, but its absence. Ruth Franklin, in A Thousand Darknesses, suggests that our minds distill and pound the chaos of life into something resembling a coherent shape. We place some kind of editorial framework, some principle of selection around the events of the past, a faithful and yet inevitably incomplete representation of actual events. Franklin's argument, however, makes allowance neither for the accuracy of witness testimony nor for the adherence to such testimony on the part of the post-memory generation. As children of survivors, we carry on the legacy of the traumatic rupture, as it has been described, with a willful, deliberate embrace or through the patterns and underlying strains of upbringing. An offspring of survivors feel shut out. The Holocaust, even in its narrative absence, becomes our legacy. I, like others in my position, have assimilated what has been said and what has been left unsaid. I consider this is my legacy, and there may be an indirect psychological impact. For the generation of grandchildren of survivors, coming to the past is a far more circuitous route. The third generation comes to the knowledge of the realities of the past, unprompted and unguided. They have been described as adoptive witnesses who enter the landscape of memory in pursuit of the tapestry of familial connections and continuity, of unlocking family history and reactivating family roots. Passing on the history to the third generation is complex. How does one responsibly transmit absence and loss? It has been identified that among third generation survivors, pride, strength, and gratitude are as much a part of the legacy as the negative effects of the experience. By reconstructing their grandparents' history, resurfacing their legacy, they are realizing the strength and heroic battles their grandparents fought in order to get to the place when the grandchildren knew them. There are indications that rather than ruminating on the pain of their ancestors, focusing attention on their strength may result in the ability to move past any pathological symptoms. In situations where second generation survivors seem to be plagued with feelings of guilt or responsibility for their parents, there is some evidence that this sense of guilt can be inherited by the third generation. And there is research on the concept of Jewish guilt being passed down generationally, as I described about the stress genes being passed down generationally. Children have been known to have vivid nightmares of the Holocaust, despite never experiencing the trauma. That was my experience. And there may be a connection to later generations developing PTSD symptoms. The concept of post-memory developed by Marianne Hirsch that I described earlier talks about the generation after, the third generation, who also relate to the personal, collective, and cultural traumas of those who came before them, can be characterized by deep, emotional, and mediated knowledge of events that are transmitted through stories, images, and behaviors that are so intense that it feels like memory. So to sum up some key aspects of post-memory, there is a generational distance. not a direct recollection, but an imaginative investment and a projection that bridges the gap between generations. Is often formed through haunting, mediated representations like photos, stories, and objects, as well as family secrets. Post-memory can dominate the lives of descendants, shaping their own identity and narrative, sometimes making them feel as though they lived through the traumatic events. And context is relevant. While originally linked to Holocaust studies and children of survivors, the concept has been applied. This concept of post-memory has been applied to various contexts of historical trauma, such as slavery, exile, and war. So to conclude, I have never thought of myself as a victim, even though my parents obviously were, but they didn't live like victims. Their resilience and my father's mantra of, you can't undo yesterday and you have no idea what will be tomorrow, so you must make today as good as you can. That was my inspiration. That's a big part of my personal legacy. At the same time, I hope I have acknowledged some of the complexity of the subject if we think of legacy collectively. The trauma of the Holocaust is likely to affect many people beyond survivors and their offspring. What is important is how we process that trauma. As a survivor, second generation and third generation, there needs to be a way. I believe that storytelling is really important. And one of our greatest tools is our creativity in all its many forms. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much for this profound talk. We are now officially open the discussion. And as I mentioned before, you can write it in the chat or you can raise your hand. And I think that maybe I'll start. I have a question that I've been holding in my stomach. I was wondering, you and I were talking a lot about sentence that my grandmother used to say, like, I have to go to work, otherwise they're gonna kill me.
Yeah.
And who's gonna kill her in the sewing place in the kibbutz? But what I am thinking about, we know that a lot of mental disease, I don't know how to call it, mental disease.
Call it trauma.
Yeah, started in the Holocaust, like anorexia, bulimia. I was wondering if those kind of mental illnesses or situation passed on, because I know a lot of friends and family that have to finish the food from the plate because that's how they grew up. I wonder if the research ever mentioned something like that, like a mental disease passing on, because we know there's a genetic component.
I think that I just want to go back to that little bit that you said about having to eat what's on your plate. Something that when we were moving between Poland and towards Belgium, where we lived for 2 years, my mother would say to me, eat up, eat everything on your plate. You don't know when you will get another meal. And she was right. And that stayed with me. It didn't develop into anything else, but I can imagine how it can lead into it. I haven't discovered anything in the literature, but then maybe I need to dig deeper to find that. But I do think that the habits from very young childhood can have that effect of how you treat food. And I actually think the whole notion of somebody who's been through trauma and been deprived of food, it could become a real issue because all you can think about is how hungry you are. My mother used to say, I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry. It comes out in her, when she talked about it, she said, all I could think of was that I was hungry and cold. So I guess those things do impact. Somebody else might have more knowledge about this. I don't know if they do.
Carol, go ahead. You just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Helen. Takes a lot of courage. One of the things about the food thing I can relate to big time, which has gone across the generations. But one of the things that I notice of people who were actually the second generation of people who went, who were in Europe, went through the camps and had deprived lives, as opposed to the trauma of being displaced, is that those children had children with health issues, quite common in Wellington anyway. So have you found any research about that?
No, but observation has shown that there are all sorts of things that trigger a lot of illnesses in second and third generation that can be tracked back to what the parents went through. And I think that this is another layer that is probably a bit beyond my pay scale at the moment, but I think that it's definitely an interesting concept. And it's also interesting that, that whole issue of food. My father used to eat really fast. And I used to say, is that so nobody will steal it from you? And that was possibly true. It was, so that those kinds of habits get transmitted to the next generation. My sister and I were pretty good at eating fast, and it can go on. So that's just a very minor version of it. But I have a feeling that habits that developed or pain that developed during the Holocaust, it's possible that through the biological genes, the genes that I talked about, that some of that could get passed on too, because they're stress genes that they're talking about.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to the food one. My mother was very grateful when I put food on her plate when we went to social events, because I put what she could eat, not like my husband who put too much on, and she would eat everything that was put on her plate. So it was really tough for her to get through that plate if he did it. So that's a funny side of it. But yeah, I can see many ways with that. But yes, there are some more genetic. I'd be interested. I think there is some epigenetic damage that isn't behavioral or not emotional, which is actually maybe even scientific, that has been done.
Oh, that's worth exploring. That might be somebody's Lador Vador topic another time, because I think that there's probably a whole lot related to food. And interestingly, when I wrote my book, I put in small descriptions. There are some small descriptions of food because it seems so important.
Yes, my mother spent a lot of time telling me how much the ration was at Auschwitz.
Oh, really?
Yes, so and she didn't. That was one of the main things about how little they had each day to survive on, and yet they fasted on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, I actually wrote a small piece in this, and I haven't given you all the little clippings, but there is a story of my father in the death brigade, the Totten Brigade, where they had been digging over bodies and extracting gold teeth and then burning what was left. They brought them up. And it was a small group of 150 that got allocated to do that. But 134 of them survived to escape. But it was a terrifying place to be, but somehow they managed to make friends with the guards. Not friends, but to be able to have a sensible conversation. And they asked if they could respect Yom Kippur, because somebody had put up a little block showing the dates, scratched it into the wall, and they knew they knew it was Yom Kippur, and they were allowed to, and they did it. They did a little mini service in the corner of the bunk room. So yeah, that whole notion of fasting, I think that happened in a lot of camps with people who recognised the date and did. And you can imagine the impact of your children and grandchildren learning about that. It just puts a whole different picture on respect for Yom Kippur, doesn't it? Could be a little bit part of the legacy as well.
Thank you.
I have a memory of my grandparents never throwing food from the fridge. Food lasting forever.
Oh, we have all been known to go and clean out the fridge at my mother's place. Okay. How's everybody else going? Are there more questions? You need to unmute.
Unmute. Hello. Thank you, Helen. That was really, really moving. More than that, firstly, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share your paper with us, because I tried taking notes, but I sometimes didn't get to the end of sentences. So
I don't mind doing that. If
that'd be great.
If anybody's interested, I could tidy up the typos, and I could.
No, you don't have to do anything.
And yeah, if I send that to you, Tom, would that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I can
And
when
anybody...
I'm sharing after the session, when I'm sharing the recording, I can add an attachment of documents.
Yeah.
No, you won't get it straight away.
No, okay.
But I will send it out. I'll send it out to Tom later on. I can send it directly to you, Ruthie, but
yeah, sure.
But there may be others, I don't know.
So I'd like to ask a question, because you alluded to it. And I guess one of the things, firstly, the parenting of the parents. I think all immigrant children must have to do that. Just if they're like, my parents spoke Yiddish to us and we spoke English to them, and that's how they learned to speak English, right? Like there was, or there was a literacy test in New York State for being able to vote, and my mother had never seen a kind of paragraphs and answer A through E, like a reading comprehension test. Well, so she and I cheated. I was about 8 or 9, and we cheated. And this woman, the invigilator, must have seen us. I wasn't ever very subtle anyway. And, I'd say, B, Ma, put it in B. And that's how she passed her literacy test. So I think the kids had to run interference for their parents on some level. But I'm very moved with your idea of how we had to imagine things because we heard stories. Like I heard stories under the kitchen table when I was 3 and 4 years old. And but we had no images. So we had to create those images and in fact create stories to fill in blanks that you know were things that didn't make sense. So you had to make some sense of it. And I think I spent a lot of time. And the last thing I wanted to say was there was a lot of violence in my home. And I think the problem was our my parents had no therapy or anything. And
none of them did.
yeah, and I know. So, I mean, so when they got racked up, there was no sense of proportionality. And I wonder if other people had similar, experiences. Like you got it for everything. There wasn't like one smack for this and two smacks for that. It was like, especially once my father got stuck in, there was no stopping till it was over. It had nothing to do with whatever had started it off. And I think they just carried that with them, such a lot of anger. And we know from our own work in this country on domestic violence, like the family are the freebies. Like you can do things to your family you could never do to a stranger in the street. And so there were lots of reasons why they kept it within the family as well as our own. Anyway, I'm not making sense. Thank you.
You are actually, Ruthie. You are, because everybody's responds differently. But I can imagine that it's unfiltered if you haven't, when you come out of something like the Holocaust, it's completely unfiltered. And that makes it really challenging and really difficult. I think that was one of the things that struck me, was coming across stories of all the different ways that sometimes survivors behave. And yet I was gladdened to hear that there's no more mental health issues for survivors' children, the second generation, than there are for non-survivors. So I think that's the one thing that came through, that a lot of people did a lot of very good things. Some did it for themselves and some did it for their children, and some children had to do it for their parents. So it's a two-way thing.
So I simply want to acknowledge that my parents got much softer as the years went on. So by the time what you're talking about, the grandchildren, my children were born, and my brother's children, my parents were really different. They were much softer. There'd been enough time to build that resilience.
Yeah, some resilience and to mellow and to push some of those memories back a little bit, and just to be in the present. Being in the present. That was my dad's mantra, to be in the present.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly powerful. Has anybody else got any comment? Thank you, Ruthie. Yeah.
Thank you.
David Schwartz. David, go ahead.
Unmute yourself. Good.
Thank you, Helen. I'd like to know what you feel about the future of Holocaust remembrance. I don't want to raise the issue of whether or not the Jewish people should continue remembering the Holocaust, because that's a whole separate issue, I think. But how Holocaust remembrance can retain the importance of that never again.
It's a biggie, isn't it?
Yes, it affects all of us who are listening to you today, because we all obviously do have an interest in Holocaust remembrance and your views on it and your experiences of it. But if we can sort of put ourselves aside, in the sense that there will be generations who possibly are not affected by epigenetics, but whose access to Holocaust remembrance is through writings like the wonderful writers Elie Wiesel or Molevi, or through the interviews which were done for the Holocaust Memorial Program. Is this enough to actually maintain a national memory of what happened?
Is anything ever enough? I mean, it's so momentous, but I do believe in the power of the arts taking it to another place. So if there are dramatic performances that can be reworked and redeveloped over the years, if the books, the written word, no doubt, has a huge place. But there's also that narration, the oral culture that I think is quite important, and it's the ongoing telling the stories verbally, not just through and I don't know about films. Maybe films will help, but I don't have a real answer. I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts. I just think that we have to keep using our creative practices to embrace as many people as possible while we can, and hope that that will get passed on.
So do you think that, for instance, Picasso's painting of Guernica or the Goya artwork of the wars of his time have done what you are just saying, that form of art is powerful enough to retain memory, pass
it's
on?
Not quite enough, but it's a stimulus. It's like a trigger that when you see something like that, and you may go and think, I need to know about the history of that, and you research the history of it if you haven't learnt it before. There are triggers, and I think that visual triggers, oral triggers, I think that monuments, on the one hand, you will pass them. On the other hand, they might just push a little button. I don't know. I couldn't say, but I would hope that would have that sort of effect. 2 to 3. Does that help? Not really. Has anybody else got any questions?
Rachel, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you, Helen. That was really, really informative. Just on the back of that conversation, I was wondering about what you think the appetite is for us to continue telling these stories or expressing it through the arts currently, particularly in response to that beautiful awakening moment for you with that piece that you have written it down somewhere and I've forgotten what it's called.
Making my mark for the 6 million dead.
Thank you. Making my mark. Yeah, making my mark, and how beautifully that was received at that time, and how you feel that would be received now, or any of us expressing ourselves in the arts, currently.
It's a really good question, because at the moment, so many people are confusing Israeli politics with Jewish people in the diaspora. I mean, to me, it's insane, but it is happening. But I think if we tell our honest stories, I do think that it's something we just need to keep doing it. And when I talk to non-Jewish people about my book, for instance, they're 100% with me. I don't get any pushback at all. I don't know if the bookshops are feeling that. I believe that there are some bookshops that have felt reticent about having anything about Jewish people and Israel. But we're not talking about Israel. We're actually talking about the Holocaust that happened between 1939 and 1945, and everything that went before and after it.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think we have to have courage, and discretion, and ability to listen, and hopefully there will be people who will listen to us.
Yeah. Okay.
Can't promise. We can never promise with that, but I think it's important. I think it's important that we keep doing it. We keep writing our stories. We keep making our artwork. We keep making the films. We keep doing all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing that'll be left after we've gone, apart from somebody making recordings of us. And I can't tell you how moving it is to have a recording of a dead parent's words and to be listening to them talking about the Holocaust. It was extraordinary. Mm-hmm. There is some, but there's not a huge amount of that. And we have to hang on to those.
Okay.
We do, and pass them on. And hopefully there'll be enough of the third generation to pass it on as well.
Okay. Thank you for that. Could I just quickly also, just listening to what David Schwartz was saying about, Picasso and Goya, I'm not the child of a Holocaust survivor, but I'm married to a child of a Holocaust survivor.
Mm-hmm.
But I have grown up with the stories of the pogroms that my family experienced and where we came from and how we arrived in New Zealand. And I'm just interested in the concept of how far back this epigenetics might actually go. I know you were talking specifically around the Holocaust and second and third generation, but I personally feel it in me, even though my family arrived here in 1856. But I know the stories of how they arrived here and why they arrived here, and it was running from pogroms. And I kind of personally feel that explains characteristics that I have, anxiety, those sorts of things there should be no reason for that. But growing up with those stories, it kind of explains things.
I think that history sits with people, and it's when it's conveyed, it's actually conveyed to a much bigger space and more people. So for instance, I can be talking about a lot of these things, and there'll be people outside of even my circle who might discover and connect. And what you're saying is that you connect and you experience and you relive and it passes through. It's that intergenerational experience going down. I think that that's possible. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I can't tell you, but it seems possible to me. And sometimes I'm not surprised when those things happen. Yeah. You kind of get to my age and a lot of things don't surprise me anymore, but yeah.
Thank you.
Helen, I want to address 2 comments on the chat.
Yes, please.
Okay. So Michael Smith, first of all, Maori writers, artists, filmmakers, playwrights, etc. offer examples of passing on stories many generations after the primary experience. History is constantly reviewed and enriched.
Yeah. Michael's right. And I think that you see it in Maori plays about the past that are put on now that have an immediacy when you go. It's just a small example. So yeah, I agree.
And also, hold on, that's from Vera. Thank you for this program. Yes, the note would be wonderful. I signed up for this because I am 70 and have always been tough, nearly as tough as my survivor parents. But I am recently experiencing some epigenetic reactions, such as heightened stress sensitivity and even what may be called some PTSD triggering. I'm finding that I have heightened sensitivity to the Gaza war, the anti-Israel activities, and anti-Semitism we see these days. I seem to be having a similar reaction to the treatment of immigrants in my country, USA, and as a refugee from an Iron Curtain to the sorry, English is the third language, sorry, to the authoritarian turn of our government. Sorry, Vera, would you like to read it so I won't butcher your language?
Okay, sorry, I'm coming on. Yes, it's I left the word out. So, as a refugee from an Iron Curtain country to the authoritarian turn of our government. So, I'm in the United States, so you might have followed some of what's going on there. So,
yes.
In essence, what I was trying to say, that I definitely feel the truth of the epigenetic phenomena. So, thank you.
It's good to feel that acknowledged when something seems out of sorts and wrong. I think what you're describing there is really interesting, because to actually have it emerging later in life, I think that possibly does happen for a number of people, that the things that passed them by when they were busy in their lives, somehow it's not necessarily as easy later in life when we're more fragile physically and emotionally. So yeah, I'm sorry to
I
hear
think
it.
part of the reason I think part of the reason that I was able to ward it off, I guess is the word, is because I was a journalist in my earlier life, and you have that veneer, that armor generally
Yeah.
covering stuff.
Yeah. It's hard when you lose the armor too, isn't it? When the armor starts to slip away. Yeah. That could be a little bit of what you're talking about too, is that, you have a meaning to every day, and it starts early and it finishes late. And later on, it's not quite as intense, and there's room for the armor to slip away, and you do get a little bit more fragile, for want of a better word. Yeah.
Marinos LaRouge added to Vera's point. Great point about the programs. I found two NZ Jews in the 1930s who saw rising anti-Semitism through the lens of their experience of violent pogroms in the Russian Empire.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah. I can tell you, Vera, that I feel you about as an Israeli that never experienced any anti-Semitism, because everyone around me are Jews or Israelis. I mean, I think that the Gaza war specifically, because I don't want to say it's anywhere similar to the Holocaust, but there are some sort of similarities that all of a sudden you see the stories of your grandparents coming. It sounds very familiar. especially because I was a student in my former years in one of those kibbutzes that got attacked. And all of a sudden you hear the story that sounds so familiar, and something in that is triggering. And all of a sudden you see the people reaction, and you understand what the Jews in the diaspora always talk about. This is something that us as an Israeli immigrants, I don't think that we truly understand what you guys have been going through. To deal with that epidemic and epigenetic trauma and the environment, we at least had the protection of our bubble to deal with what we're feeling. And also, you know that the neighbor next house is dealing with the same kind of trauma. You're laughing about it together. You're making jokes about how your grandfather eating the soup like this as if he was still in Auschwitz. I don't think that you had the same protection to laugh about it and to cry about it as we did.
That's an interesting comment because in Israel you're Jewish because you're there. You know, here we're Jewish and we're out of a Jewish environment, and so yes, the relationships are different. The relationships with the the circles, the widening circles around us are different, and the understanding. There's a lot of understanding missing here in this part of the world, Australia and New Zealand. There's a lot of understanding that needs to happen before anti-Semitism goes away. And I don't think we're anywhere near it. I mean, I'm delighted that there's some educational programs. I was really pleased to hear about what's being introduced and so on. But it's a small start. It's a small start because there are generations that are not as empathetic. Yeah. And we didn't realize they weren't empathetic. I came to New Zealand in 1968, and I didn't think there was anything much in the way of anti-Semitism. There was the odd throwaway comment, and there was stuff that, the people, and suddenly you get a trigger like the Gaza war, and it seems to bring out the worst of what was sitting under the surface. A lot of it was obviously sitting under the surface. And maybe I was just trying to get on with life too much and didn't have time to focus on it. I don't know. Other people might have had different experiences. How are we doing? I think we're almost at the end of our time. If there's any more questions, I can be emailed through the Holocaust Centre. And I think...
Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you join us again to the series, to the next event. That's going to be quite profound as well. If you want to register for the series, there's still time. The registration is open until the end of April. And I'm looking forward to see you all again. And once we finish doing some editing of the recording, I will send it to you, as well as Helen's wording.
Thank you.
And my apologies for the visual presentation, which I spent a bit of time on. And somehow the Zoom, there was a problem. There was a technical problem that I couldn't fix in a hurry.
Bye, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.